So in this recording, I'm going to give you a very short introduction to evolution, because we're going to need that to understand endosymbiosis, or the endosymbiotic hypothesis, of the idea that chloroplasts and mitochondria were actually at one time prokaryotes. So evolution, by definition, is genetic change in a population over time. And Darwin was the one that kind of presented this idea to the world, and he really summarized it in this idea of descent with modification. This idea that there is some inherent variation in reproducing populations, and among those variants, those that interact with the environment in a way that gives them the highest reproductive success will be selected for. This is natural selection. And we'll talk a lot more about evolution as the quarter progresses, and you will never get away from evolution when you talk about biology. It is the lens through which all biology needs to be viewed. Now, in a kind of heavy-handed example of evolution, let's investigate this definition. So we're going to talk about genetic change in a population over time. So for example, here we have a population of beetles. And you can see this population of beetles has some genetic variation. We see most of the beetles have this green gene, yet a very small percentage of those beetles have the red gene. Now, when the environment changes, because we've just dumped a bunch of pesticide on a field of crops where the beetles live, we see that the minority of the beetles with this mutation survive. This mutation, this genetic variability, puts that beetle at an advantage because it is now resistant to the insecticide. Well, it's difficult to reproduce if you're dead. So the reproductive advantage lies with the mutant in this case, and it starts to have babies. And the population then grows. And if we then look at the bottom of the slide and look at the population of beetles here, it's 100% red. This is genetic change from the top population over time through generations. This is evolution. Now, if you take the idea of evolution and run it to its logical end, backwards through time, as you can see here, you get a tree of life. So all the extant species, the living species, are at the top. And if we go back and we think about descent with modification, this ultimately leads logically then to a single population that was the progenitor of all life on Earth. When we look at some of the major events of the history of life on Earth, we can see life evolved about 3.8 billion years ago. And prokaryotic life was abundant at that time. This was the type of life that evolved first. Selection of certain modifications of that prokaryotic life probably selected for, in some environments, this ancestor to eukaryotes. But then a very special event occurred, this endosymbiotic event, where a mitochondria, what would become a mitochondria, which was a respiring bacteria, was engulfed but not destroyed. And that created a relationship, an endosymbiotic relationship. Endo, inside, symbiosis, living together. Then a second event occurred later in the timeline where a photosynthesizing chloroplast was engulfed, and this now is the progenitor of all green plants. So this idea of an interaction between one of our ancestors and a prokaryotic cell that resulted in this symbiotic relationship is what we call the endosymbiotic theory. And so again, if we see this as a cartoon, we can look at this ancestral prokaryote incurring mutation and change over time to become more like a eukaryote. And then ultimately, we have this ancestral bacteria that is engulfed but not destroyed to become mitochondria. A second event where that photosynthetic prokaryote is engulfed but not destroyed to become the ancestor of all chloroplasts.